series from the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University. Hello, I'm Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University. This podcast for December 2017, at the cusp of the new year that is to come before us, is bittersweet. We promised podcast listeners that we would relay some information when we had it, and that information is about Mick Winter. And with a lot of celebration and a fair amount of happiness, we can report that we're now talking about Dr. Mick Winter. So we thought we'd use this podcast to provide the update about what actually happened at the end of Dr. Mick Winter's examination, and perhaps tips for punters about supervisors and examiners that are handling the posthumous thesis. But I'm joined in this podcast by the other supervisor, my supervisory mate through this process, the person I accidentally got married to at some point a long time ago, Professor Steve Redhead. Hello, Steve.
Hello.
And we should also do a big shout out to Catherine and to Joanna, Mick's wonderful wife and daughter. We are thrilled that we've been able to create this great resolution for you. And in fact, his birthday was last week and it was celebrated as Dr. Mick Winter. So, Steve, what we want to talk about, I think, is the surprise of this and the challenge of the posthumous thesis from a supervisory perspective, from a family perspective also, and also from an examiner's perspective. So what was the surprise for you? What's the special nature, do you think, of the posthumous thesis that indeed surprised you?
Well, I certainly think we should say, as you have already done, that this is a celebration of someone's life and work, really, because Mick was a terrific student and had contributed an enormous amount to the planet. But we were only suddenly told about his death once the work was well on. You know, he'd done 150,000 words of his PhD and was already editing down from that. Mick was a professional writer and had produced, in anybody's language, a major piece of work.
Yes.
But he was already editing down, and I think the shock of suddenly being told about his death was that, you know, we'd already had Skype meetings only perhaps 2 or 3 days before. Yes. We didn't know anything about this, and in some ways we were able to rescue the thesis process because he'd done so much of the preliminary work. If he'd lived, he would have simply carried on editing down that thesis, and it would have been the same as it was eventually.
Yes, because what's interesting in this, because the first question is really about the surprises, Steve. And, you know, if he'd lived, he would have submitted the thesis in less than 3 months. So we were entering our 10 draft cycle, and he would have certainly submitted within 3 months, maybe even 2.5. And yet the surprise for me, because I thought, oh, look, it might take 3 or 4 months for us to move it through. The big surprise for me was how long it took. And it took me, having worked on it every single day, to come home from work and work on Mick's thesis, as you remember, sitting on the beanbag, just working gently with the prose. The surprise was the amount of time it took us to get it to examinable. And standard's not the right word, but shape perhaps is.
Yes, I think shape is the right word. So I think, I've never supervised in this way before. I never had to deal with the shock of the death of a student, whose work, I say, we had great respect for. But I think the fact that he'd done so much of that work made a difference. So it wasn't so great a shock. You were able to put the ship right as far as the thesis process was concerned. And a year later, we're talking, as you say, about Dr. Mick Winter.
Yeah, and that's terrific. The metaphor I used, and I think Catherine quite appreciated this metaphor too, was I felt like I was restoring a painting. Yeah. Why it took me so long is I wasn't actually doing a slash and burn edit or a more aggressive edit as you would do with a student who's alive and you can have a robust conversation about the editing. It was a very delicate situation where I was almost taking a very, very light brush and delicately dusting and enhancing the colours, because I really wanted to make sure that it was his thesis. So did you learn anything about supervision from supervising a posthumous thesis? Did you learn anything about the sort of andragogical process, if you like, that you wouldn't have known if you hadn't supervised a posthumous one?
I think I learnt about actually how to treat something like this in the proper way. Our editing, for a start, and that was a very important part of the process, but also Flinders University and all its processes. I think we should congratulate.
Oh, we should. And look, can I actually do a special shout out to Natalie Hills too, because as you know, our examination officer, she was firstly very respectful of Catherine and Joanna, but also did incredible work that you don't think about, like making sure the cover page had the correct logo on it, making sure it was uploaded properly to the library, that the examiners were treated respectfully in a really unusual way. So it was a really, from an administrative professional staff member perspective, it was really a bespoke process. And I want to do a big shout out to the Office of Graduate Research. Yes, I'm the Dean, but this was a really class act.
I thought so too, and I think these things you simply don't know because you've never supervised a posthumous thesis before, you've not been involved in it. But there are many, many things which were surprising and you had to deal with them, and secondly, really worthy of great congratulation, I think.
Yes, I concur, and the office certainly was very proud of its work. And what we've tried to do is, obviously, all posthumous theses are more bespoke than the bespoke PhD, really. But as you and I were going through this process, and I accidentally happened to be Dean, I was very conscious that my office, that we work through the process of this. So we go through it once, so the next time it happens, it's got decency and dignity and integrity, and it's much easier, if you like, on the student, the family, and indeed the supervisor. So we've got a bit of a shape of a process in place about, and I think digitisation also helps it too. It is a bit more respectful.
And I think people can learn from this process, those around the world who are listening to some podcasts. I think people can learn for good.
Yeah. And speaking of learning from it, I want to raise what you and I talked about for the sort of 6 months we were working on this thesis, and that was the worries about the examination process, right? Now, in fact, we shared this with my wonderful father, Kevin Brabazon, who was also a great friend of Mick's as well, and there are so many challenges through the examination process, and I was quite fearful of it because, and you remember me, just before we submitted the thesis, I was very stressed. Very, very stressed and very worried. And I think my worry came from, it'd be interesting if yours was different, that I thought the thesis had to go through cleanly as an A or a 1, so without correction, because, how could an examiner ask a dead student to produce correction? So I was sort of thinking it was an all or nothing process for an examiner. It either goes through as an A as clean, or there may be problems. So it's a rare thesis where you either go through as an A, and we had a risk of it being a fail. Was that a worry for you?
Not really. I must admit I was always sort of more optimistic than you were, really. And I think the choice of examiners was very important because Mick, as I say, his background all his life was a professional writer in things like advertising and media. And we chose as examiners very experienced academics who were also professional writers and working in the professional field. I think that helped greatly. So you did marry the expertise of the student, which was great, and the expertise of the supervisors, which was great. But I think those are the sorts of problems you would get in posthumous theses, that if you hadn't married those things correctly, there's no way of talking to the person who'd passed on.
Yes, and thank you for saying that, because I spent a lot of time thinking through examiners, and one examiner doesn't know the other examiner in the Australian system.
Quite exactly, quite right.
Because there is no oral exam, and of course, thankfully, ironically, there's no oral exam.
I know, it's bizarre, isn't it? After we've talked about all exams for so many years.
Yes, indeed, and in this case, we've done well out of it. But I chose 2 professors, very senior professors, also professional writers that work through journalism, media production, and also produced a large number of books, including trade books. So both of them had that spectrum of professional communication.
Exactly, I think that was important.
That was crucial. They were also both radically interdisciplinary too, because, particularly in Australia at the moment, there's all this nonsense about the humanities versus the sciences and so forth. And of course, in Mick's thesis, he was quoting biologists alongside Zizek.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that made it a fascinating thesis, and I think it is actually online, isn't it now?
Look, it is.
And people, anyone with interest in this, for whatever reason, should read it, because it has that, the radical interdisciplinarity is fascinating, especially from from a professional writer's point of view. You get radical interdisciplinarity from high theoretical point of view, but you rarely get it from a professional point of view.
That's correct. And one other variable I'd say about the two great examiners we chose, who were very senior, very experienced, they were experienced supervisors and experienced examiners, and that was important. So this was and thankfully I approached two and they both said yes. Yeah. But that experience really mattered, and you could see it in their reports,
Yes,
Steve.
They were fascinating reports, and I think it's a process to be celebrated when you get something of a process of that quality with really high quality examination reports, which again we can all learn from.
And they were very reflexive reports too. That they were reflecting on the nature of examining a posthumous thesis, so they didn't pretend it wasn't existing, that they were dealing with a phantom student. It was like, okay, this is the reality, this is what we're assessing here. And they actually said they would have given exactly the same assessment if the student had been alive or dead.
Yes.
And the regret at the end, particularly in one of the... by the way, can I just say, we haven't actually done the proper report on how the examiners came through. Both examiners came through as 2As. That means 2 passed without correction. Very, very, very rare.
In the Australian system,
Australian system, between, say, 5 and 8% of PhDs come through at what we call a double A or a double 1, and Mick's was one of them. And it was very interesting that one of the examiners certainly stated, look, I'm not going to be easy on this thesis. That's not respectful for Mick. It's not respectful for the supervisors.
No, and they weren't.
And they were, but actually made the point, look, I'm not going to be sort of filled with emotion about the sadness of this. No. I'm actually going to assess this because everybody deserves this. And at the end, the examiner, did that iterative loop back where the tragedy is, some of this work sort of stops here. That I would have had a conversation with Mick and we would have produced work together, because I'm terribly interested in the approaches that he's done. So that was the sadness to it. But we did mention a bit about the irony of not having an oral exam, and that's what allowed Mick to get through as a posthumous thesis, if you will. But one of the examiners certainly mentioned the podcasts, and about page 2 of the thesis I listed, and I think we're at about 38 or 39 podcasts.
With Mick. Yes,
that
that's
you,
right,
Mick, and I recorded through the entire 3 years of the thesis. Yeah. And also, as our wonderful podcast listeners know, we did a podcast, how many weeks ago? Well, actually, it would have been probably 2 or 3 months ago, before it went out to examination, to explain the work we had done, to explain the supervision, to get it to examination. We did that to help colleagues around the world think about this, but also for the examiners to hear. Yeah. So we listed a full contents page of the podcasts. So I know one of the examiners, at least, we don't know about the other one, but one of the examiners listened to them all and listened to the last one and she said she felt very comfortable examining the thesis, knowing the transparency of the process. Yeah. So what do you think was the role of podcasts? Ironically, in this process.
Yes, I think it's interesting that, as you say, that it was mentioned by examiners. And certainly podcasts were a major part of the way in which we supervised Mick, because he was often in another country. And also, I think we were learning as we were going along. And if people want to listen to them, I mean, they're on Libsyn, all of them are on Libsyn.
And iTunes.
A lot of them are on my website as well, steveredden.zone. I think the learning process was partly ours, so that I hadn't supervised in that sort of way in the past. Obviously, technology didn't allow me to do that in the past.
That's right.
But it did allow us to do it in this particular case. And I think there's some absolutely fascinating discussions which go on and go off in different directions. But I don't think we ever thought about that issue of academic integrity at the time.
No, we were treating it as sonic note-taking, so we've come up with a good idea and we wanted a record of it for the student to work on that week. That's how I think we're applying it. But now I'm much more conscious that it adds maybe it's the Australian experience.
It's vital.
That it adds transparency to the process, because I really want examiners, and when I'm an examiner, I want to know that it is the student's work. And increasingly, as we're sitting in Australia, where still about half of the Australian universities don't have an oral exam, I can't prove it, and it's increasingly making me uncomfortable, to be frank with you.
And it is interesting that in a system that doesn't have an oral exam, or mostly doesn't have an oral exam, you've actually got oral communication in those podcasts being tested, not necessarily assessed, but the person has to rub up against their supervisors and show quite a lot of staunchness.
Yeah.
Because the kinds of questions we're asking on the podcasts or issues we're raising are quite difficult. And in Mick's case, you'll if people want to hear it, you'll hear really quite amazing discussions going on the specificity of, say, theory in his thesis or particular movie lines or whatever it is.
Yeah, and Zizek thinking about interdisciplinarity, Badiou, some really top-end work, and we certainly didn't pull any punches, and it was great to sort of share that. And there's a whole group of people, tens of thousands of people, who have also shared Mick Winter's journey, which is why we particularly want to do this final podcast and sort of report back post the examination about what actually happened. So, Steve, anything else you could think of? Because I've never examined a posthumous PhD. I don't think you have either.
No, I haven't.
What do you think are the specific challenges in the examination of it? I've only realised as I was desperate to sort of try and create a transparent, accountable situation for the examiners that would read Mick's thesis. But what would you be after as an examiner of this situation?
One of the things I learnt as a result of the examiners we did ask to examine is that you should take the emotion out. Now, that's an incredibly difficult thing. It's very easy to sit here in 39 degrees in Adelaide and say that you should do that, but actually that's an extremely difficult thing to do. But that's part of the process, and it should always be part of the process in examining.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, and a couple of things to say about that. As I said, one of the examiners did that overtly, Steve, actually in the introduction, stating, look, this is a terrible situation, this is an unusual situation, I could get emotional and I choose not to, right? So one of them did that. The other examiner only afterwards, after they'd done their report, and the interesting thing is he'd done about 8 versions of the report from what he reported to us, the sort of long involved sort of emotional engagement.
He did,
and he actually then just got rid of that, and he kept doing a different version of the report, and he ended up doing a single page discussing the intellectual merits of it and stating, look, I'm not going to emotionally get into this. I've done multiple versions of this report and I'm not going to go there.
No, and that's what I learnt from, that's what you should do.
Can I just say they were the two, I've seen hundreds, maybe thousands at this point of PhD examination reports, and they were the 2 finest reports I'd ever seen, actually. It was amazing that such a difficult task and a difficult job that you're asking somebody to do for a very intellectually challenging thesis. This wasn't an easy connect the dots thesis. This was a full throttle PhD. And to see 2 colleagues handle it with such decency and class and integrity, I think was really quite humbling. I felt I sat in my office, my wonderful Natalie Hill said, we've got the reports and I can release them to you. And I sat in my office and I read them, and I wasn't emotional. I thought I was going to be very emotional. Actually, I was just filled with sort of awe and respect that really great scholars exist on the planet that do a good job, in difficult times for higher education. And you and I talk about this a lot. The problem with universities at the moment is universities don't know what they're for. And one of the things I think I've been reminded of through the Mick Winter process and the fine examination through it is the best of what a university system can do, I think. So, Steve, final question is really advice for others. So, let's hope we never, ever, 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 ever have to go through this again. But other people will have to. And what advice would you offer to supervisors or examiners or indeed universities confronting this saddest of sad moments in doctoral education?
Well, I think that we should learn from the processes that have existed in posthumous thesis supervision. This is a great example, which I think is why the podcast is very useful for potential students and potential supervisors. But I think learning is going to be something that people will develop, actually, in these sad circumstances. There will be other sad circumstances, and people can learn from best practice like this.
Yeah, and I think it is important that, and it's another great reason why students should finish PhDs quickly too. Can I just put that out there? Because Mick finished a first draft in 2 years, 9 months. Now, if he'd let that lag, he wouldn't have a PhD today, right? So he finished it at speed, he worked hard, and he was a terrific student. From your and my perspective, we had a full draft to work with. And what I would say to supervisors out there, and this is coming from really the bottom of my heart really, is if you haven't got a full draft to work with, whatever standard that may be, don't start this. Really, don't start this. I had a full draft with a professional writer who'd edited it down from 150,000 words to 100,000 words, and I still found it tough going, right? So therefore, if you haven't got a full draft, don't kid yourself that it's going to be an easy process. Am I being too harsh on that, Steve?
No, definitely not.
Don't kid yourself.
No, you've got to be strong. Otherwise, it's a waste of time.
Yeah, because don't think, oh, look, you can fill in the gaps. You really, really can't. And you'll end up, upsetting, relatives and partners and kids even more than they're already upset. The other thing I'd say to you is when you take on something like this, Steve, you've got to be aware you are supervising the family as well, and you have a responsibility. And certainly that's why I was tortured, as you know, most days. I'd be sort of banging my head against the desk and really desolate about it because I wanted to do a good job for Mick, but I also wanted to do a good job for his wonderful wife and daughter and their friends, our friends. And that puts incredible pressure on supervisors. So I'd say don't go into this thinking it's going to be a great experience. It was really emotionally complex, and as you said, emotionally quite difficult and hard to park those emotions too, don't you think?
I think so, yeah.
Unbelievable. Well, Steve, thank you for the work we've done together. Enormous respects to Catherine, enormous respects to Joanna, all Mick's friends, our friends around the world that supported us through this, to those two fine examiners, we thank you very much. And really everybody around us who has stuck with us. We need to thank my wonderful boss, the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research, Rob Saint, who agreed to let us have a go, and then also, of course, had to sign off as Dean at the end because I couldn't sign off because of conflict of interest. So that's a tremendous experience. And as you rightly said, we have a fantastic Office of Graduate Research at Flinders, and when tested in a really complicated situation like this, they rose to the challenge and produced a fantastic, transparent, remarkable process where full academic integrity was in place. So thank you, Steve, and we did it. For more information about the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University, please refer to www.flinders.edu.au/graduate-research.